The idea that money will never be the same after this war in Ukraine. How has it highlighted the utility of crypto?
Well, I think, let's say the dollar might never be the same, right? I mean, I think the biggest thing that's happened in the last 10 years in lots of ways, maybe longer, is when Europe, the US said, hey, Russia, those reserves that you thought were yours, they're not really your reserves. So what does that mean? It means the dollar or treasuries as a risk-free asset isn't so risk-free. It's not risk-free if you're Russian, and maybe if you're Chinese, you're like, it might not be risk-free either. And so I think we're entering in a world that's unknown, where people are going to struggle to figure out what is the reserve currency. The U.S. isn't going away, right? The dollar's not going away, but it's not going to be the sole place. And so I think you're going to see this hodgepodge of assets. Gold, certainly digital assets are going to be part of that bucket. The whole world's not going to flip to Bitcoin overnight, but you're going to see more and more people say, I want to have some of my money outside of the sovereign.
How do you deal with that debate, though? Because a lot of people are talking about the problem with cryptocurrency is that you can use it to circumvent these sanctions. On the other hand, people in the community are saying, that's the point, right? We don't want government censorship to be able to take away our property.
So let's talk big and small. There is zero chance the Russian government can use cryptocurrencies to circumvent. Right? We're regulated by 25 different agencies, Galaxy, and I'm sure, you know, FTX and Binance and the others have just as many. And so almost all crypto moves through exchanges. Those exchanges have KYC AML processes, just like TradeFi exchanges. And so, plus Bitcoin is a public blockchain. You know, way back we hired Mike Morrell, who had run the CIA, Galaxy, and a few other companies, to do a study on Bitcoin. And he did like a 10 weeks exhaustive study with the security agencies, with the three-letter agencies, with crypto companies. And he came up with a thesis that if you were going to design a trap to catch criminals, it would look a lot like the Bitcoin blockchain. And so it's just, Elizabeth Warren is just wrong when she thinks you can use Bitcoin for the Russia to escape sanctions. And we're looking at it the wrong way. The Russian ruble has depreciated over 90% in the last 10 years. Just this year alone, I think high to low is like 65%. The Turkish lira did the same. Bitcoin is a lifeline to people in countries with really poor stewardship of their economy. And we should be thrilled that Russians can get some of their money in Bitcoin so they're not completely broke holding worthless rubles.
Well, that brings me to the question of what the use case is, because in the context we're talking about it, it's essentially as a replacement for fiat currencies. Is that how you view what the future of digital assets is?
Listen,
is it a store of value?
So digital assets is a big word, right? I think Bitcoin has this really beautiful lane of being digital gold or a store of value. Everyone has a human right to have the fruits of their labor stored somewhere. And if you don't trust your government's currency, traditionally we put it in diamonds or gold. This is the first really digital version of that. And so I think that's Bitcoin's use case. Now listen, there's also a lot of other digital assets. There's digital stable coins or digital dollars or euros. There's things, Ethereum, digital networks, NFTs, right? And so the revolution that's happening isn't just in one lane. But I think for Bitcoin, it really is a place you store value.
How important are the CBDCs, right? Because today when I saw the headline that the Saudis might start selling the Chinese oil in yuan, the first thing I thought about was, oh, they're so far ahead of us with the digital yuan.
Yeah, so I think this is the biggest national security concern that every country should have. And as every citizen, you've got to understand that one CBDC and a stablecoin ain't the same thing, right? It all comes down to who controls them. And so if you look at the Chinese version, where it's a blockchain of one, right? It's complete, total transparency into every transaction you do. So you're giving up complete privacy, right? The version that we're pushing for, the blockchain community here in the US, what Brian Brooks pushed when he was the head of the OCC, was private companies running on a public blockchain, but those assets backed by assets held at Fed banks. Right? So it's where your privacy goes. I was on a call literally with the central bank governor of Brazil at one point, and I was pointing out that their president didn't really like gay people. I just Googled Bolsonaro gay, and there's about 18 pages of pretty uncomfortable stuff. And so if you're gay in Brazil, you don't want your country knowing every last purchase you made. So where do we care about privacy? And this sounds nuanced, but it is the single most important part of understanding how important this fight of CBDCs is.
McGlone was bringing up correlations here, and a lot of the haters will bring up how positively Bitcoin is correlated with stocks as a way to say, hey, that's not a haven, that's not an inflation hedge. How do you answer to that?
I think bald mics think alike to start with. Listen, Bitcoin went up a lot last year on this story of the Fed printing money forever. That's what pushed all risk assets up, right? We had this unbelievable amount of liquidity. And it came off because the Fed, Chairman Powell finally said, hey, I got to take this more seriously than I've been taking it, and I'm going to get hawkish. We're starting to see a little bit of a breakdown. I don't think Bitcoin can rally aggressively until we get a pause. And I would tell you that because Bitcoin's a narrative story. It's bringing people into a community. Yeah. There are 150 million people into that community. Most are staying in it. Right? That's the 8th biggest country in the world. It's bigger than Russia. So Bitcoin holders are a bigger country if you think it's sovereignty than Russia. But to bring new people in, it's hard when their house is on fire. And right now, if you talk to any investor, Chinese stocks are cratering, tech stocks are cratering. Their mindset isn't like, let me see where I can find more risk. And so, well, we're going to hit a pause. The war will end. Let's, pray to God. The Fed will go and we'll start saying, hey, we've priced in the Fed. And once markets hit some equilibrium, I think you're going to see the narrative really take off.
So where would you set a target for year end this year and 5 years out?
Great question. Listen, I think, like the other bald mic, the NASDAQ has further to go to the downside this year. I think literally the Fed hasn't even started hiking rates. They haven't started pulling liquidity from the system. And so I've, the whole year, thought we'd be a 30,000, 50,000 range in Bitcoin. Risk to the upside, not the downside. But I think, 5 years out, if Bitcoin's not at 500,000, I'm wrong on the adoption cycle, right? We see an adoption cycle that accelerates. Bitcoin grew so much faster last year, crypto grew, than the internet did at its best years in the 90s. And so I see this going viral everywhere, if it's in the Mideast or in pension funds in the United States, all getting ready to participate.
We have heard a number of mayors push for this, and really since the beginning, there's been this kind of egalitarian, obviously libertarian feeling in the Bitcoin community. You mentioned 150 million people have now adopted it, but I never expected there to be so many, predominantly white male whales. And we really have seen that. Is that a problem?
Well, listen, I mean, white males own most of the money in the world. And so I would tell you that you would expect any new technology to have a lot of them in it. What's more promising is if you look at people of color as a percentage of people who participate, it's higher in blacks, it's higher in Hispanics. When I look at young versus old, right, this is a generational move. I cheekily say I identify as Gen Z. It's because it's a revolution of young people who looked up and said, I don't like the way the world's looking. Right? I'm losing faith, I'm losing trust. And we see trust breaking down everywhere. And so I think if you looked at young versus old, there's a much bigger representation in young. Certainly there are more white whales than people of color whales because they started out with so much more, right? I mean, blacks are 13% of the population, they own 1.5% of the wealth. And so it would have been shocking if that was the difference.
Mike, what about the idea that Bitcoin can be the great equalizer? If there's going to be a parallel financial system being created via new technology, do you have any evidence that it could be a more equal system?
Well, crypto gives everybody equal access, right? Anybody can participate in the Bitcoin network. I don't need to have a certain level of wealth. I don't need to be in a private equity or a venture fund. I can go on and I can participate. I can build on it. I can invest in it.
And DeFi is part of the big promise as well, right?
Same thing with DeFi, and quite frankly, same thing with NFT communities, right? What is the surprise to me this year is that NFTs have become the killer app of the blockchain. It's the first place we said, hey, we're using this outside of an experiment, outside of a sandbox. We're using it in real life. Artists are making money. Musicians are making money. Big brands are making money. And so I actually think it's the most exciting thing that's going on right now.
You mentioned Gen Z was the big difference, the fact that this is a younger space. What does that mean in terms of how you're hiring and the types of people you're hiring?
Well, it's one of our great focuses and challenges, right? A lot of people don't learn crypto or even to code anymore in colleges, and so we've got a program where we're looking at non-traditional people. I've hired people off of Twitter, but for us, we're trying to balance, bridging this institutional world and being able to speak the language and teach institutions about crypto and pull them in, and staying on the cutting edge of crypto and bringing the crypto people in. And so it's a real balance. And we're trying to create teams of people, both sides, who can appreciate what the other guy brings.
Well, let's talk about where those teams are centered, where you're doing the hiring. We started this conversation with Eric Adams in New York City. What will it take to make this the crypto capital of the United States?
Listen, first thing is we got to get rid of the BIT license. It is very difficult to do business in New York State because of the BIT license, period. And so that, I think, is essential.
Who's standing in the way? Because everyone says we got to get rid of the BIT license.
The greatest problem with bureaucracy is once something gets, put in place, it's hard to get rid of it. And so, New York DFS, it's a state thing. There's a bunch of people lobbying. Everyone tells me it's going to happen. We'll see. 40%, I think, of all money that went into venture in this space went into New York City last year, right? Big institutions and small ones. New York is part of the heartbeat of crypto. Certainly Silicon Valley is. Miami's becoming part of that. It's more of a tax thing and a very crafty mayor. And so I think Eric is saying the right things. What's most important to know is your children are going to spend more and more time in the metaverse than you do. They already do, right? They're going to grow up on their phone. Their phone is the most important thing they own by the time they're 15 or 20 years old, or when you're 30 or 40 years old, right? Think about what happens when you lose your iPhone. And this is going to be the money of the metaverse.
Well, why is it important then for New York to be a leader here? I mean, tons of your peers and rivals have moved to the Bahamas, have moved to Puerto Rico, let alone inside the United States.
From New York, it's important. Listen, we employ, I think, 315 people. Our average salary last year, our median salary, was over $240,000. Like, those are good, high-paying jobs that New Yorkers have. Like, I don't want to be forced to move all those to Miami or to the Bahamas. And if regulation doesn't get better in the United States, right? SEC has been slow, and they've been regulating by enforcement, not by clarity.
Mike, we only have about 30 seconds left. On the subject of regulation, what were your thoughts on Biden's executive order from last week?
Well put.
The crypto community was worried. We have had nothing but bad vibe out of Elizabeth Warren, who has a whole lot of say. The Gensler SEC has been, like I said, regulating via enforcement and not clarity. Yeah. And there's been a lot of nervousness around this. And so we were really pleased. It sets a framework to say, hey, let's make sure we understand this is a real industry America needs to be competitive at, that stablecoins is the most important thing. And so let's hope they follow up that way. I do think the politics have shifted, right? Even on the Democratic side, it's no longer anti-crypto. It's like, hold on, there are a lot of crypto voters.
Yeah.